Hello. It's the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. It is July 20th, 2021, and July 21st in Tokyo. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of JFIT, which is our Japan Center. We are at UCSD at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Our website there is gps.ucsd.edu. Look us up if you're interested in what we have to offer. Our Japan Center is JFIT, and you can find that at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that website, you find a number of tabs. There's the news and media one where you can sign up to our newsflash. And right next to it is the Japan Zoominars tab. And I have an announcement on that tab because we finally we're able to figure out how to organize our gallery. And here it is. So if you go to that tab, it looks like this, the JZ Gallery. And it is organized into business and economy, politics, society, and arts, culture, history, and more, much more. And if you click any of these buttons, you get a list like this. And so we hope that this makes it easier for you to find past recordings, maybe use some of these for teachings, as in like meet the author, and otherwise just enjoy. And that's a good thing because we're actually going to go on a summer break. We will not compete with the Olympics. So after today, we're going to go on a 6-week vacation. We will be back next on September 7th with Mr. Masaaki Shirakawa, who was the 37th governor of the Bank of Japan and as such a colleague of Ben Bernanke and Jean-Claude Trichet. So he has a lot of stories to tell. Join us for that. And up in the meantime, listen to our recorded events. All right, so today we're going to talk about Thwarted, as in this picture. And we have Dave Laney with us. He has 4 books. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to introduce his books. I'm not counting all the articles that he's read. You can go to his website. The one on the left is the most recent one, Empire of Hope, the Sentimental Politics of Japanese Decline. And Dave, I was wondering whether the cover there has Prime Minister Abe bowling alone. I'm not sure about that. So, okay, so here's Dave. Let me stop my share and introduce our guest here. Professor David Laney, welcome to the Japan Zoominar.
Thank you very much. I'm just so excited actually to be sandwiched between Mr. Shibusawa and Mr. Shirakawa, because this really is sort of a couple of peaks and then the valley in the middle. So I represent the mountain pass of Japanese, of the Zoominar, I guess.
Well, we have to talk about something serious, which is the Olympics. But let me introduce you for those who don't know you. So Dave Laney is professor at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies, which is basically our sibling at Waseda University. He holds a BA from the Department of Government at Wesleyan and an MA from the Department of Government at Cornell University, where he also earned his PhD. He has served as an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also, in between, is a regional affairs officer at the U.S. State Department. Then he was an associate professor, again, at Madison, and a professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at Princeton. Since 2017, I believe, Dave, you've been at Waseda. So I've already introduced the 4 books. And more recently, you have written some very interesting pieces, one on the internationalization and Ronald Doerr's changing approach to Japan, which is a fascinating piece. You have one on a paper on the opening a storyline in the 2020 Olympics, which you wrote, I think, last year. And there is this larger story that you're working on right now, which is sort of the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, which was also thwarted, or the celebration of which was also thwarted. And national narratives, emotion, and the construction of a grand strategy in the Asia Pacific takes some chutzpah to bring the grand strategy back in as a political scientist, I think. So yesterday you tweeted, recently found out that the Olympics are happening in Tokyo this year. That seems totally crazy. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they're not talking about it here, because it seems like it would be a big story. So yeah, no, I mean, it's astonishing to me even now that we're hosting an Olympics in the midst of our 4th state of emergency. Like, I mean, I'm certain this is not exactly the way in which any of the prime ministers responsible wanted this to go through. So anyway, So yeah, thank you very much for introducing me. And I guess, shall I start with my PowerPoint?
Yeah,
PowerPoint?
so we're talking about thwarted commemorations, right?
Sure.
Let me just remind the audience that it's not just the Olympics. There
No.
have been a large number of events. I remember I was in Tokyo early last year, and it was the emperor's 60th birthday,
Right.
which is usually a huge deal.
Big deal.
And it was also the new emperor's 60th birthday, and so that was thwarted right then and there. Then it was the Meiji Restoration. There are a bunch of other things, and so this happens to other countries as well, I assume. But it seems that in Japan at this particular moment, there is a certain negativity around that fits into your research on the narrative of the decline and the story of my life, a story of our country.
Right.
We can never celebrate when we're supposed to celebrate. So yeah, but why don't you start us off with some thoughts on that topic?
Sure. I think that like most of my research projects, this one actually begins not with any sort of specific plan, but just more out of weird fluky luck than anything else. In my first year at Waseda, I was encouraged to apply for kakenhi, so the national grants, and I put it off until the last minute. And then one of my colleagues said to me, "Are you applying?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm planning to put in an application because they're due later today." And I was like, "Oh my God, I got to get together something quickly." So I knew that it was coming up would be the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration. So I decided just to put in a very quick application focusing on the commemoration of that, figuring I've written on tourism in the past. I can say something about national history, and hopefully it'll go through. I was hoping, my plan was basically just to put in a good show by doing a decent application, both because I thought it'd be good practice for the following year when I might actually be able to put together a real application. I ended up actually getting the grant, probably because no one else was doing anything like this, and it was actually so timely. But the problem was that the year begins, Prime Minister Abe announces in the his beginning of the year address that this is the 150th anniversary of Meiji, sort of hints, as he had long before then, that there were going to be big national commemorations of this. And I was like, oh great, this should work out. And then nothing happens. Like basically nothing happens. There was all sorts of local commemorations in the prefectures that you would expect, especially the former Sacho-Dohi provinces, Kagoshima, Yamaguchi, Saga, and I'm thinking in Shikoku. Why am I just spacing right now? No, sorry, the one that starts with K. And of course, I'm going to get hammered by my friends from the prefecture for having forget this. But in any case, that those prefectures that were sort of responsible for the revolutionaries that took over the government in 1868, did commemorate this quite a bit. But when the actual commemoration took place at the national level, it was quite minimal. And so I got interested in why that's the case, both because it sort of squished my research plans, and also because I thought, well, maybe there's a story to tell here. And that's sort of how I got interested in this. At the time, I then sort of segued into thinking maybe the Olympics will become a replacement for that, an opportunity to talk about a national narrative, not realizing, of course, that the COVID disaster was going to then wipe out the Olympics as well, or at least dramatically change them in a way that makes them very difficult to use as the commemoration of Japan's resurgence. Like whatever the Olympics are going to be this week, they're not going to play the role that they were initially designed to. And because my last book that you mentioned, Empire of Hope, deals with how national narrative structures effective emotional representation in politics, I got interested in what it would mean to have commemorations that didn't go through, that couldn't play the function that they were supposed to, both for the creators as well as for the larger public. I'll put up just a brief PowerPoint I've got, if that's okay. The two major ones that I'm thinking about here, as you and I have both noted, are of course the Olympics, the doomed to be mostly empty Olympics, as well as the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, which arguably could have been a big deal, right? I mean, the 150th anniversary of Japan's emergence, or formal emergence as a modern state. And this is a photograph of the actual commemoration with Prime Minister Abe. And as you can see, it's basically just a closed room. It was 2 hours long. This was not a nationally televised event. It wasn't held at a big stadium or anything like that. It was basically just held in a government office with a couple of brief speeches, and that was it. And for me, as somebody who's interested in narrative and what it means to tell a story of Japan, I thought that the sort of inability to make this into a big moment was something worth exploring. It's something obviously I talk about a bit in Empire of Hope, but that I wanted to develop a little further. One of the scholars who I used, or whose work I used in writing this, is Xian Nagai, and I wanted to mention her for a couple of reasons. Number one is that she just left Stanford and is now teaching at University of Chicago, where I had thought she was going to be colleagues with Lauren Berlantz, the great literature scholar whose work, Cruel Optimism, is sort of one of the central pieces in the study of emotion and social and political life. Certainly very influential to me. Professor Berlantz unfortunately died just a month ago, far too early. Professor Nagai is an exceptionally good scholar whose work on affect and emotion has also been really important. And her most recent book, Theory of the Gimmick, analyzes how gimmicks are literary devices that also tell us a lot about the nature of contemporary capitalism. I mean, this is a sort of a standard way of approaching things in contemporary literary criticism. But as she argues here, gimmicks are fundamentally one thing across these instances that she analyzes in her book. They're overrated devices that strike us as working too little, like they're labor-saving tricks, but also they're working too hard, strained efforts to get our attention. The gimmick is thus capitalism's most successful aesthetic category, but also its biggest embarrassment and structural problem. With its dubious yet attractive promises about the saving of time, the reduction of labor, and the expansion of value, it gives us tantalizing glimpses of a world in which social life will no longer be organized by labor, while indexing one that continuously regenerates the conditions keeping labor's social necessity in place. I mention that in part because something about commemorations always strikes me as a little gimmicky. And I actually think that that's not a very uncommon sense, because one thing that's it's really apparent right now in a lot of the public debate about the Olympics in Japan is that even though I think the opposition to the Olympics is not nearly as extensive or as deep as I think it's being reported in the foreign press, I think there's a lot of doubt and concern. What is pervasive is a sense that whatever Japan is doing, it's not because of the sort of intrinsic, storied value of the Olympics. It's either because of the political machinations of Prime Minister Suga and his cabinet to stay in power, or it's about just sort of a grim sense of obligation that Japan got the damn thing, so now we have to go ahead with it no matter what. That it basically has to happen, but no one seems to be taking seriously the lofty rhetoric surrounding the Olympics and what it represents to global mankind or to the athletes or whatever. It's part of the discussion, but it's fairly minimal. And instead, people seem to recognize that going ahead with it is just something that has to be done for other sets of diplomatic, political, symbolic reasons that don't really involve the games themselves. And that does seem to be pretty widespread.
Choice? I mean, would the IOC have negotiated?
Japan always had a choice, right? I mean, no, the IOC would not have negotiated. But Japan's already losing a lot of money. Presumably Suga or the cabinet could have decided, we'll bite the bullet now. We'll take the hit now and we'll go ahead and cancel the Olympics. And yes, we're going to owe a lot of money, but in the long run, it's better than losing more lives. It's better than having a depressing Olympics. It's better than doing something poorly. I mean, the choice was there. I'm not suggesting that would have been a better choice, but the choice was there, at least in my view. So in any case, the photo here obviously is from the Meiji Restoration commemoration. And to me, what's interesting about this is that in the run-up to it, there was some discussion in the Western press, a few articles in English that indicated that Japan was going to have trouble commemorating the Meiji because the history of Japan's modernization is so problematic, right? Yes, Japan modernizes, but then it becomes an imperial nation, leads to war, leads to defeat, and so forth. That actually was the story that was told in 1968, which made it virtually impossible for Prime Minister Sato, who was equally eager to hold an 100th anniversary celebration, to do anything major, right? Because the opposition in the midst of the student movement, in the midst of the riots, in the midst of the protests, the opposition to any sort of celebration of Japan's modernization was so severe that it became impossible for him to hold the big public commemoration that he wanted to. But that's actually not what I found this time. What I found this time, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but what I found this time about Meiji was that it was much more about internal debates about what the restoration itself represents. In thinking again about the representation of narrative, I then got interested in the fact that the original team running the opening ceremonies was going to be led by Nobuta Mansai in the middle, the famous actor. But a lot of the creative control of the ceremonies would be by the director Yamazaki Takashi on the left, unless the image is reversed, but the tallest gentleman there. And Yamazaki's arguably Japan's most popular, certainly live action director. He's done a couple of animated films, including Doraemon Stand By Me, that's a big hit, but most famous for science fiction spectacles like Space Battleship Yamato, the Japan Academy Award-winning Eternal Zero, very controversial for its representations of the kamikaze pilots. Kaisoku to Yobareta Otoko, a man called Pirate, about the mid-century oil magnate Idemitsu Sazo, which is this is the subject of another paper I've been writing. And the Always Sancho Yuhi series, Always Sunset on 3rd Street series, that sort of takes a romantic look at Japan's post-war resurgence. The third of those movies actually involves this lovable bunch of neighbors in Tokyo glued to their televisions, their new televisions, watching the 1964 Olympics, which is represented, as it so often is in Japan, as this historic moment in which Japan kind of reemerges from the shadows of World War II. But that's actually not the way in which the story was originally or unproblematically told. As anyone who has seen the film Tokyo Olympiad by Kon Ichikawa knows, the 1964 Olympics can be represented in a lot of different ways. And for anyone who's listening who hasn't seen this movie, this documentary, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's really a great, great, great piece of work. And even now is regarded as one of the most important sports films ever made. When the movie itself was made, it was the official documentary funded by the Japanese government. Ichikawa was picked because they realized that dealing with Kurosawa Akira, who they originally got to, was going to be too much of a pain in the neck. So they brought in Ichikawa, who then made this movie that was somber and focused on the loneliness of individual athletes, that in many ways is quite sad, about the spectacle of the Olympics. It's a remarkable film. The Japanese government wasn't pleased with the result. They made a recut version that's pretty disastrous, that's much shorter, that is a much more triumphal image, but it's really the longer film, the real film, that has survived. And that is now the sort of the classic statement about the Olympics, even though the Olympics are in many ways publicly represented in Japan as the triumphal moment that I think the Japanese government wanted. And of course, it's going to be hard to do in this case because the images from this Olympics are likely to be a lot less unproblematic for, I think, the sort of long-term commemoration. Getting back to the Meiji Restoration, the main reason why I think the Meiji commemoration didn't go forward was not because of any concerns about the sort of longer historiography of modern Japan, as it was a fundamental rethinking of the restoration itself. Over the past 15 or 20 years, there's been an incredible onslaught of very, very popular books that treat the Meiji Restoration lead figures as terrorists in some cases, as violent power grabbers and so forth, largely because the stories are being told from perspectives outside of Yamaguchi, outside of Kagoshima. They're being told by authors from Fukushima, the last stronghold of one of the last domains that was loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate. And the memory entrepreneurs, as Michael Vert, the historian at Marquette, has described it in his book, Meiji Restoration Losers, these sort of local historians have told a story about the restoration, have told stories about the restoration that make it much harder to present as the nationally unifying story that I think Abe, whose roots are from Yamaguchi, would want it to be. And so I think ultimately the reason why they decided not to go ahead with it was that, especially at a time that the government was trying to show its support for Fukushima through the Reconstruction Olympics, going ahead with a Meiji Restoration commemoration that would have basically been giving the middle finger to the forefathers of Fukushima Prefecture and other prefectures, especially to the north, would have been considered really problematic. So in any case, these are the sorts of issues that sort of are inspiring me to combine these two sets of commemorations. Ultimately, a narrative functions only if there is an ending that it's working towards, right? When you watch a mystery film or read a mystery novel or a romance or an adventure story, you know what's supposed to happen, right? And if it doesn't happen, it might seem artsy, but in many ways, it's also going to be unsatisfying for a mass public. To the extent that the Olympics themselves were supposed to represent the reconstruction of post-recession Japan, or the resurgence of post-recession Japan, Japan is back. That's not the story that's being told right now. And no matter what happens out of this, the best I think that they can hope for is that Japan isn't seen as having dropped the ball, that Japan has gone ahead and done its duty by continuing with the Olympics that no one else would have actually done. But ultimately, this is not the ending that I think anybody would have wanted. And I think it suggests something about the difficulty of commemoration, that commemoration has to be planned in advance to represent a story that's supposedly going to be going through the present. But that present is always unknowable and is always vulnerable to the sorts of changes that we're seeing today. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to say with my opening PowerPoint. So.
Well, great. Thank you. Terrific. So audience, we're going to have a conversation here, and then please do feel free to type in any questions you have for Dave in the Q&A, and I'll try to weave that into our conversation as we go. So I sense, on your decline narrative, that people in Japan are quite unhappy. I haven't been there in a year, so a little more, year and a half. So I don't know. I'm not there. I only can read the newspaper, so I can't really read the air, right? That what's happening in Japan on the ground. But from an outside perspective, from the U.S. perspective, first of all, Japan doesn't look that bad. I don't think it will get hammered because the Europeans and the Latin Americans just had their soccer things. So going forward with a large event is something that other regions in the world have done. Mm-hmm. So I don't think anybody can say, well, the Japanese should have known, because there's nothing can be known right now. And an argument could be made from the rest of the world that having these Olympics could be really wholesome for many people. That is to say, the Americans can unite behind, the athletes who win a bunch of medals that the Russians are not winning, and isn't that great? It's almost like in the old days, and so I think there could be a lot of healing if somehow we can have a great contest, and it doesn't seem as if Japan is really in grave danger of the virus. A lot of the old people that would be endangered are vaccinated now. So why not? Why not just celebrate this? Why not just go and do it and have some fun?
I think that's actually the position that the Olympic Committee is trying to promote, and that also, the media are kind of promoting as well. I mean, the media themselves are deeply invested in this, like all the newspapers. This is something I should say I spoke about a couple of days ago wanted to consult one of the smartest people I know on these issues, my friend Tonami Aki, who's a professor at Tsukuba University. And, certainly the newspapers as well as the TV companies that they own have a lot invested in the Olympics, right? There's going to be a lot of tailwind at the idea of representing these positively. And so I think that a lot of the criticism seems most severe online, if you're like reading Twitter, which I do far too obsessively. But I actually think that in the larger sort of public sphere, there's kind of a resignation about the Olympics and maybe a little bit of nervousness. I don't see a lot of enthusiasm, but by the same token, I don't see the sort of opposition that we see. And I think that that's going to shift. I think that if the stories are positive, if you get to see heartwarming stories of Japanese or other athletes winning medals that they otherwise wouldn't have, or being grateful for the opportunity because this is their once in a lifetime chance to make this happen, I think that is going to turn that around. So my guess is that at the outcome of this may get represented as a story of Japan having really done something good for the global community, but it still won't be the story that they had intended to tell, right? It's still not going to be a story of Japan's rebirth or resurgence or anything like that. It could still be spun as a story of Japanese, like Japan's gentle humanism coming in to save the day, rather than the sort of vaccine chauvinism that we've seen, in the sort of competition among, vaccination rates around the world. So I think you're right. I think that that's probably where it is going to go. But I think the government has basically been fighting so many forest fires on this, right? I mean, every friggin' week, there's just another disaster, whether it's about, an athlete from a team that has a lot of positive cases sort of disappearing and saying, I'm staying in Japan, or whether it's, finding out that one of the replacement members of the creative team had just done horrendous bullying of disabled children, and as an adult seems to brag about it. I mean,
so they need a new song until Friday?
I don't know exactly how they're planning on doing that. I mean, he's saying he's withdrawn, but he wrote the music with 3 other people. And so I'm not certain that his portion can simply be brought out. It may just mean that he's not going to be there, or his name will be taken off the credits. I'm not really certain how they're going to do it, because God, that would be nuts.
Yeah. So one of the puzzles that, that I have from the outside looking at this is it doesn't seem to be handled particularly well, right? So Japan has a lot of very capable, fabulous managers, leaders, figures that could do this. And yet these Olympics seem to be run by people that are somehow from the Showa period.
Yes.
As if it were the year Showa 96. Right? And so yesterday there was the news that because of the terrorism threat, people are not allowed to take a lot of water into the stadium where they're even allowed to watch. And we're talking 35 degrees centigrade soccer matches. So who are these people that are running this, and why are not more capable people in the powerful positions there?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually hadn't thought of it that way, so I haven't actually investigated that as much as I should have. My guess is that because this is so dependent upon leadership from the national and then prefectural governments, that they're sort of limited in terms of who they can actually sort of bring in to be in leadership positions there. I'm sure that a lot of the actual people running the events, a lot of the people doing the day-to-day work are in fact quite capable, but they're just not able to make those sort of authoritative calls on their own. So I can imagine somebody sort of running up the pipeline that, we just got word that people could bring in colorless liquids that would actually be a threat. What should we do? And somebody says, well, let's ban it, right? I mean, just sort of immediately goes to DEFCON 5 because they don't want to actually get in any trouble for something going wrong, right? But yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think one thing that's going to be interesting is what happens with the opening ceremonies. The opening ceremonies was at a very late date sort of entrusted to a team of basically creative executives. And my sense is that this is because the original creative team sort of stepped aside or were pushed aside at different times. And I actually suspect that what we're going to see is an opening ceremony that doesn't have like a strong artistic vision of any sense, but that is really, really, really well put together. Like it's eye-catching. It sort of works. It's effective as sort of eye candy. It probably just won't have the sort of like story or the sort of theme that we got from, Zhang Yimou in China or Danny Boyle in the UK, which I think we would have gotten had it been Yamazaki in Japan. It would have been his own kind of story. And so I think there is some of that, but probably not enough. Yeah, sorry, long way to say I don't know. Good question. You're the one who studies business and leadership, so I think you probably understand.
Okay, I'll work on that then. So Catherine has a question. She would like to talk you to talk a little bit more about the sort of the thwarted commemoration, Olympic, Paralympic spirit. She says, you reference Ngai, but I wonder about differences and diversities in emotion, drive, desire, loss. And then there's this gambaru or the gammansuru, right? And there's many areas of Japanese culture that would lend themselves to, okay, we're going to take a hit for the world and do this. So can you talk a little bit more about these emotions that are currently happening in Japan and how they're expressed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some ways, I'm just going to have to punt on it because a lot of it, I don't think we're going to know until afterwards. I mean, one of the things in my book is I sort of stay away from any sort of ascription of actual affect to individuals or even to different groups. And I think more about its representation, just because I as much as I admire the work of Berlant and Ngai and others, I'm always a little bit reluctant to talk about how people feel, because I often feel that think that people can't even say themselves how they feel about stuff. I mean, I can't always say why I feel or how I feel about things, but I would say in this case, I think that you're absolutely right. And that in the aftermath of this, particularly if it does go smoothly or relatively smoothly, if the number of COVID cases doesn't spike very high or the number of serious cases doesn't spike very high, if there is a lot of acclaim from the international community for Japan having really gone ahead and taken one for the team, as Ulrike said, if that's the case, then I think what you've just said about the Gambaru's sort of spirit is exactly going to be where this goes, that Japan itself was willing to, put on its big boy pants and work hard in a way that other countries might not have because of our, Gambare or Gammon spirit or whatever. And there will probably be something of that in the international press, some sort of recitation of national virtue that allowed the Japanese to pull it off. So I think that's where it's going to go. But to me, that's a post facto rationalization of what actually happened. If things go sideways, if this ends up being much more of a disaster than I think it's going to be, then I think that's going to be a very different story. But I suspect it's going to go relatively smoothly.
Well, there's always also the victim story, right?
Right.
So
Sure.
Japan has long played that, or felt. It's not even played. I think it's a genuine a feeling that Japan has been victimized by all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's all
to atomic bombs, right?
I couldn't agree more. That actually is a central part of the book of Empire of Hope, in the sense that the representation of a melodramatic narrative. This comes from the literary theorist Peter Brooks, but it's largely about equating innocence with virtue with innocence. And Japan itself is basically the country to which other stuff always happens to, right? Japan is always being acted upon the world and is always responding to the world. And the sort of nationalist versions of Japanese history almost invariably sort of posit this, dark, menacing world that Japan is forced to deal with. And sure, I can imagine that very easily becoming a story afterwards if the Olympics don't go well, that this happens to us, not that we did something.
So we have a bunch of questions on the politics of this, but before I go there, let's stay with sort of that theme. The Pawan wants to know what you think how the Olympics will be remembered in the end. I mean, you've already talked of this a little bit, but I mean, in 4 years or in 8 years, are we even gonna talk about this anymore? Is this just a moment in time where we're a little bit desperate and we'll just look back and say, oh yeah, that was the one that didn't work well? Or is this actually like the New York Times was doing a big article the other day? Is this the end of the Olympics?
Oh, I don't think it's the end of the Olympics. Yeah, I don't think it's the end of the Olympics. I just think too many countries, too many companies have something at stake in continuing the Olympics, and too many athletes are invested in it, right? I mean, this is, for so many athletes, this is really their only chance to shine on the global stage. And so, no, I don't think it's the end of the Olympics. I think that's an overstatement. I do think that it's going to be a lot harder for the IOC in the coming years to maintain the fiction that it is motivated primarily by fidelity to the values of competition and so forth, rather than to the demands of cold hard cash, because of the astonishing money grubbing greed we've seen on the parts of the IOC and all this. But in terms of how it's going to be remembered, I think it's going to be remembered as a flawed event that went ahead anyway. And I think the same way that Atlanta is remembered, with the bombing, right? The bombing is one of the first things that comes up, even though it was a bombing in the midst of 14 days of competition. And, I don't think it defines the Olympics, but I think it is the first thing that people, come to. What I don't think is going to happen, I don't think people are going to remember this as this truly inspirational moment in which the world came together, because I just don't think anyone ever remembers any Olympics like that. And that's not Japan's fault.
So that's. I mean, I remember Munich, which had a similar issue. It was
sure, of course, right.
And yeah, so there are very few Olympic moments that we actually. I think that's actually a very nice point. We don't actually remember Olympics in any particular way. They're a thing of the moment.
No,
and of course the athletes do, right? And we remember some of the athletes. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe what that should be. That's great. And we don't remember the other stuff, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that's surprising to me is that I think that for a lot of the public memory about the 1964 Olympics in Japan, I think is premised upon an expectation that the world saw Japan in 1964 the way in which people are later on taught to believe that the world was seeing Japan. In other words, this was this moment in which we sort of reemerged, when in fact, I think most people don't really remember the 64 Olympics at all, unless they've seen that movie or we're here in Japan. But it's not, when people find out in Japan that I don't know much about the 64 Olympics, it's not like they're surprised. It's not like they're, oh my God, you don't remember. I think they sort of understand deep down it's probably not that big a deal overseas. And I think that's the way this will sort of play out over the long run. I think you're right.
So Studio Ghibli, Miyazaki has a movie on the 1964 Olympics, which actually is very interesting. It's about a class of a high school class, coming of age sort of thing, and they're kind of caught in the 1964 Olympics. It's very good. And when watching it, what you come to realize is that the 1964 Olympics were much more important for Japan than they were for the world. I mean, the narrative is that the world recognizes Japan as big, but that's not the case, I think. I think the case is that Japan realized that it was big.
No, and I think
that's
thing. Right? I think that's like the 2008 Olympics in China, right? I mean, I think that, again, same thing. People noticed it, especially the opening ceremonies were these like dramatic. I mean, just in their scope, they were kind of unimaginably huge. But by the same token, it's not like that actually meant anything in terms of how China was going to be appreciated over the next few years. Right. But I think it does mean something within China.
On that topic, Nathan wonders whether you had any thoughts on the next Olympics in Beijing, taking place in no more than 6 months from now. This is the Winter Olympics, I assume, right? And of course, China wants to overtake Japan. He writes that in quotation marks. So is there a potential conflict that if the Chinese Winter Olympics are great and the Japanese Summer Olympics are really not so great in a matter of 6 months, would that mean anything in international relations, or the opposite?
I don't think they'll mean anything in international relations really, except to China and Japan. I don't think anyone else in the world in 6 months is going to be thinking about the Tokyo Olympics. And I don't think, as the Winter Olympics go on in China, I don't think people are going to make the comparison, partly because the Summer and Winter Olympics are just, they're so visibly different. They're just so many, they're just kind of incomparable to one another in so many ways. I do think, however, that there are absolutely things that the governments would talk about. I mean, I don't expect, if Japan had canceled its Olympics, I wouldn't expect the Chinese government to handle the fact that they're holding the first ones with the sort of forbearance that one might hope. I imagine there would be a little bit of sort of chest beating about the fact that China's bringing the Olympics back. What's interesting to me is that in at least a fair amount of the Western press and in English language Twitter, there's a lot of attention to the competition between China and Japan on this. I've seen very little of that in Japanese. I don't mean that it's not there, but it's interesting that how infrequently that's actually addressed. And even the few citations I've seen to it in Japanese are often to articles from Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal in Japanese, rather than to actually the Japanese press. So it's not something that people here are talking about. But I can imagine that had the Olympics gotten canceled, it would have actually been something that would have stuck in people's craw quite a bit.
That might be the answer to that question. Yeah. Right? So we can't have it canceled in Japan and not canceled in China. Maybe there is something to that.
Yeah, I think possibly.
So we have two questions on a topic I know nothing about. So let me just read them. Linda and Kirsten both want to know about Kawase Naomi's film. Mm-hmm. The first question is, the original plan was to include images taken by bystanders. So what is the purpose of the film now if the film was to be about bystanders? And then the second part of that question is, in terms of remembering, right, via cultural projection, can you say a little bit more about the selection of Kawase Naomi as a director of the current Olympic film? And then she had some recent, apparently expressed some doubts about the COVID measures and the athletes' experiences. Great questions. I'm going to admit with a great deal of embarrassment that I actually didn't realize that Kawase Naomi had been chosen. I think it's a fascinating choice. So, I mean, now that you mentioned, what do I think about it? I think I'm kind of amazed at the gutsiness of choosing her, because to me, that's like choosing Ichikawa Kon in 1964, right? This is not somebody who is necessarily someone who's certainly going to put together
a pretty remarkable aesthetic piece of work, but it may not be the sort of immediately celebratory thing that the producers would want. I have no idea what she's going to do now. I mean, she's exceptionally creative, so I'm certain that she'll come up with something interesting. But I actually just don't know. But in terms of her recent comments in the press about COVID measures and athletes' experiences, I don't know. I think I've been wondering about this because so many celebrities, companies, obviously the emperor himself, have sort of come out with public statements that have seemed like distancing themselves from the Olympics, that I think there's a lot of trepidation that something could go terribly, terribly wrong with these Olympics, and being worried that you are going to be associated with it, that you're going to be seen as one of the forces driving a public health catastrophe. And so I imagine there's a certain just tentativeness in it that is both professional, but also I think deeply personal to a lot of these people. Just because I mean, I can sort of sit from the sidelines and watch with a combination of amazement and some, bewilderment and some amusement at the decisions that are being made, because I'm not implicated in any of them. But I imagine that if my professional life were in any way dependent upon the Olympics, they're going ahead at a time that they could benefit me, despite the risks to people. I'd feel quite terrible if something were to go really, really wrong. And so I imagine that's part of it, but I haven't thought about this more than that. That's, more about this. The people writing the questions know far more about this than I do. I should have picked a topic I've done more research on for today's Zoom and
No. This is
I really like today's Zoom and I'm retitling Stuff I Don't Know.
Well,
by David Laney.
I'm gonna follow up with the two and see whether we can do something about Kawase Naomi's selection in a future Japan Zoominar. So Hiroki has a follow-up question on this, which is, what's his definition of success? So what are the criteria by which the Tokyo Olympics 2020 could be considered a success? Is it zero COVID death among the athletes? Is it that, so that's his suggestion. I would suggest that the world actually can forget about COVID and just, we're watching this on our TV screens, and somehow the athletes are bringing it together, and the venues are great and it looks great on TV, and we're all watching it. Or what would that be? What is the success? Do we need a star? Do we need a figure? Do we need an athlete to capture all of our sort of acogares?
I think you're absolutely right that this comes down to a large degree to international acclaim for the Olympics. I think especially if the European and American and Australian press, I think if the English language press that's sort of read widely around the world seems largely enthusiastic about what Japan has accomplished, about the individual stars, I think that's what will allow this to be a success. I mean, deaths among the athletes, I think that's kind of a minimal baseline, because again, given the age of most of the athletes, I suspect that most of them are not at grave risk of dying from COVID. I suppose it's possible, but it seems relatively unlikely. And I imagine that that's sort of a minimal baseline. But I do think much more important is going to be how it's being discussed in the international press, because the Japanese press is very, very sensitive to this, right? This is in a lot of the domestic coverage, as I think everyone here is aware, many of you are aware, a lot of the domestic coverage in Japan does address how the international media are talking about the Olympics, are talking about the health situation, or talking about Japan's preparations. And so, I think a lot of it will come down to how it's being represented in the global press. So if there are major success stories, if people do focus upon the beauty of the stadium, if people do focus upon how polite the Japanese are, even as they're not allowing people to the stadiums, or not allowing people to have water, I think that those stories will sort of carry the day. That's my guess.
Yeah, and I think the opposite would be if something were to happen in the world that would completely focus the news on that event and take it away from the Tokyo Olympics. That probably be the disaster scenario.
Yeah, you're right. If something happening outside of Japan could do that, or I mean, I do think if there were, I do think any sort of scandals associated with any of the events, right? No, because it can happen, right? Not because of any problems that Japan's caused or anything like that, but you can imagine, a cheating scandal. You can imagine all sorts of ways in which a given event might become a bigger story than people might want it to be. And that just combined with these sort of larger environmental or circumstantial problems would become sort of a real minus.
So how important is the government in driving the media narrative? So over the last, under Abenomics, the government had a great marketing team, right? And they had these three arrows, and they had a really good presentation of why Japan is back and how they were going to do it. And Suga has continued that in a way. Are they working on the narrative? I mean, are they driving the media narrative, or have they lost the sort of the handle over that?
That's a good question. I don't think that they're in control of it. And I think, again, partly because they're just working so hard to react to circumstances. I mean, this is like an incredibly difficult situation, right? Trying to manage a public health crisis and a mammoth, international spectacle at the same time is a real challenge for any government. And so I think that, just trying to put out forest fires on a daily basis makes it hard to maintain a lot of message discipline. So I'm not terribly surprised that the government doesn't need to control this. I think that, as I said, though, I think they've got a lot of tailwind from the media. I mean, if you watch, even when Oyamada Keigo, that was the musician who had bullied developmentally disabled children in his youth, there was like a massive online campaign to get him dropped from the Olympics, and he ultimately did step aside. But actually, a lot of the coverage in the press and on TV was fairly hesitant about what to do, was careful, and basically was like, well, he made a sincere apology and so forth. And I don't think it's because they were carrying his water, or certainly not because they were responding to what the government wanted, but because I think that the media organizations want the Olympics to go ahead and be successful and not have too many different distractions. So I don't think that the government has a lot of opposition from the media on this. So I don't think it's controlling the message so much as relying upon the sort of diverse set of stakeholders in the Olympics to kind of police the message in their own way.
So there are lots of protests. So we get a lot of information in the US of pictures, images of no Olympics and people demonstrating. We have a question on the role of women in this, not women in general, kind of said to be more worried about public health, I suppose. I don't know whether that's true, but there were no women in your pictures of the 150th Meiji thing. I note for the record, Osawa Mari and Ueno Shizuko, who are two of the leading Japanese professors of gender studies, I guess.
Yeah, and one of those is my former boss, I should know.
Yeah, you go. So you know them. They want protests, right? And so what is the impact, is the question, of those protests? Is it more aimed at satisfying their own base and their own role in the women's narrative in Japan, or the women's organizations, or is this a real expression of what a large number of Japanese?
So I think, it's a very good question, and I've nothing but respect for Professors Osawa and Ueno. In many ways, I'm glad they're doing it, because I do have a sort of romantic attachment to protest movements myself. But I think there's two things going on. I don't think that they're representative of a large, sort of strong anti-Olympics sense among the general public. They're definitely diehard opponents to the Olympics. But I think that, again, some of the representation of the protest and the 80% oppose the Olympics and so forth in the Western press misspecifies how intense a lot of the opposition is. What I think is happening among the more vocal opponents on the left is this is less about the Olympics than what the Olympics sort of say about Japan. A lot of the people who oppose the Olympics now also opposed bringing them into Japan in the first place, in large part because they understood, but not just the financial issues associated with the Olympics, but also that Abe was clearly trying to use them as part of his own story about helping to rebuild Japan in a way that I think as feminist scholars like Osawa and Ueno find quite offensive, both because of their own, sort of Abe's own track record in misogyny, but also because of the way in which it sort of privileges a certain way of thinking about women's role in the economy rather than women as citizens. And so I think there's a lot going on there, but I think a lot of the opposition to the Olympics has been about the representation of what kind of country Japan is supposed to be. And to the extent that Abe wanted the Olympics to represent Japan as the, powerful Asian leader that was rebuilding itself after, a decade out in the wilds, I think by the same token, so many people on the left, whether in the Communist Party or in these sort of affiliated social movements, view this as an abdication of the Japanese government's role in caring for its own citizens, right? The fact that it's going to put its, diplomatic status or international status or pride or whatever associated with these meaningless athletic ceremonies, to put that ahead of the well-being of the Japanese people. I think that people actually find this genuinely offensive, and they find it to be a real strike against the kind of country that Japan is supposed to be. So I think that's what's driving this. I'm quite sympathetic to that. So I'm not mocking it when I say that I don't think it's fully representative of a large body of the public. I don't think that makes it unimportant, but I don't think it's
I think that's the heart of the matter.
Wave. Yeah.
That the people in general say, hey, government, you're leaving us in the lurch in order to gain this very short-term sort of highlight in the news.
Right.
So we have two questions from our political science colleagues on the politics of this. TJ worries that Japan's slow take on the vaccination, which is now, of course, ramped up, may actually put some responsibility on the politicians should something happen. That is, if indeed a COVID outbreak now occurs, then the finger pointing will immediately start, right? And say, well, why were you so slow with the vaccinations? Although I would say that's just completely in line with the normal Japanese pictures. It takes forever to start, and then once it's started, it goes like fast, right. And Saudi, to tag on to that, government sort of politicians' view of things, wonders whether whether this has something to do with elections. So the timing of the election, the timing of the Olympics, should they have postponed it for 2 years, but then it wouldn't have happened for the October 2021 election. So do you see any scheming there?
Sure. Well, I mean, TJ and Saudi both know Japanese politics far better than I do, so I would defer to them in a couple of different ways. But I guess with regard to TJ's point in question, yeah, there's absolutely a risk if this gets seen as a super spreader event, and you're absolutely right in the question you wrote that I think this may become most apparent if individuals at the Paralympics are made especially vulnerable to this, right? And you can imagine a scenario in which a lot of the attention has sort of shifted away from it because of like after the Olympics sort of finished, people sort of take a sigh of relief. Oh God, we got through it. And then the Paralympics begin, and suddenly you've got thousands of athletes, many of whom do have physical issues that could make them more vulnerable coming in at a time that, I can imagine this actually being quite a disaster. I don't know that the government's fully prepared for that. But with regard to Saudi's question, that might be right. I was under the impression the IOC was absolutely not going to allow this to be laid for another year. And part of the reason for that was that having the Summer Olympics succeed the Winter Olympics was going to cause real issues for the broadcasting rights and so forth. So, I mean, you might be right. I'm sure that both Abe and Suga are thinking very much about the electoral outcomes, but I'm not sure how much a delay to 2022 was ever a viable possibility for the IOC. I could be wrong about that, but nothing about the IOC suggests to me good-hearted, public-minded generosity of spirit. And so my assumption is that, the IOC was as, obdurate and private as they have been in public.
So Don has a question that gets us a little bit back to the initial observation. But so if you compare the 1964 Olympics and 2020, so Abe was excited about the Olympics because he thought he could bring people to Japan. He could showcase Japan. I think we had Barbara Holtus on the Japan Zoominar earlier.
Right, it was great.
And they have written a book at the DIJ where there were a series of vignettes to show how the Olympics were supposed to be this new Japan presented to the world. And Donald asks about that and says where the world is today. And, it was an opportunity to show Japan off and how great Japan is and the omotenashi and all of that wonderful thing. And with COVID, this is lost. So what is really lost there? right? So, is this now a lost cause? Will Japan never be able to present itself, or does Japan have to find another way to present itself? Or how can this be made up? Is there a way out of this dilemma?
I mean, yeah, it's a great question. First of all, I think that the focus on that sort of opportunity was always a little overstated anyway. And I don't, by the way, not in the work by the DIJ scholars, who I think have been very astute in thinking through the Olympics, but I think that among almost any organizer, any country inviting the Olympics, I think there tends to be an overstatement of what those Olympics are likely to mean over the long term. I don't think, again, the 1964 Olympics, even if it bumped up tourism for a couple of years, dramatically changed the country that Japan was going to be seen as being in the coming decades. And I don't think that was going to be the case with 2020, even had COVID not happened. So I don't view the opportunity as lost in that sense. I do think, though, that you're absolutely right in what the organizers hoped, and certainly what Abe was hoping for in terms of what the Olympics were going to represent. And that was certainly the story that he and people like Yamazaki were prepared to tell, right? So I think that that's very much part of the original script. But as I think a lot of the questioners have much more astutely pointed out than I have, and certainly as Ulrike has already in her comments, I think that, there's going to be a dramatic transformation in how Japan talks about this. And I think probably this will be seen very much as, Japan having stepped in to save an event that otherwise would have failed.
Could blaming the IOC be part of that narrative?
I think it already is. I don't think that the government is going to do that for a variety of reasons, but I think that that's very much on the minds of the public. I mean, like the public, just the image of Thomas Bach is just, oh my God, like I mean, his popularity rating here has got to be somewhere, between like the Delta variant and Kim Jong-un, just in terms of his people like comedians who don't get political because they're worried about what it will cost them with their agencies in the public themselves were making jokes about Thomas Bach, just about how ridiculous he was coming to Japan, waving from behind from his closed car and so forth. So yeah, I think already the IOC's image on this, they're already being played within Japan for sure.
So we have two more questions before we're out of time. The first is that Toyota has announced that they will not advertise. Do you attach any meaning to that? And the second, and that's from Justin. And the last question is always from Professor Hugh Patrick, who asks always, what are you worried most about? And not about the Olympics, but about Japan, the thwarted commemorations, the state of the situation. So the easy question first, and then let's go to your concerns.
So as a former Toyota visiting professor at the University of Michigan, I want to be careful about talking about Toyota, because my first comment would be they want to save their ad money to pump into donations for Republican candidates who supported the insurrection. But probably that's not it. I think most likely
that is not it.
That is not it. I apologize. It was a joke. I think it's because of what I said earlier about Kawase Naomi and others, that I think there's worries that being seen, because they sort of were the tip of the iceberg. A number of other companies have since announced that they're not going to advertise either. And I think it's because, do you really want to have your triumphalist, Olympic themed ads up at a time that the story that may come after that and immediately in the news may be about a wave that the Delta variant has really taken over Osaka or parts of Tokyo or whatever, right? I mean, I think it's partly just risk management. I think they're concerned about what it could mean, figuring that the bump they're actually going to get in sales from the ads is minimal and the potential cost of an embarrassment are high. That would be my guess on this. I think it's just a calculation of what the risks are. In terms of what am I worried about, I'm the parent of two small children, and so my concerns are always about public health. Just worried about what it could mean if, I mean, I've got my first shot a couple of days ago. My in-laws have had their shots, and so I think our family is probably more or less okay. That's the hope, but I do worry about what it's going to mean to have this number of athletes, many of them unvaccinated, this number of staff, many of them unvaccinated, coming together at the same time in close quarters. Sometimes around my students who are themselves volunteers or working at the Olympics. in a way that could actually lead to the development of new variants or become the super spreader events that TJ and others have mentioned. I don't think that's super likely, so I don't like lose a lot of sleep over it, but ultimately that is my worry, is just what could be the public health consequence. Japan's going to survive this either way, but some individual people might not. And to me, that would be a grave tragedy. So.
And how about the thwarted commemorations? Are there any concerns about that? I mean, how long can a country stop celebrating its accomplishments before there is like this onset of national whatever depression?
That's a good question. I've never thought about it that way because I'm not sure that the commemorations actually do all that much. So I'm not 100% certain that the commemorations actually matter. I do think that just talking about the Olympics themselves, to the extent that Japan is taking a psychic blow from the Olympics, if Japan is seen as the country that saved them, I think that in and of itself will help turn things around, even if Japan doesn't get to tell the story it initially wanted to. That's my guess.
All right. Very good. There are many more questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of yours, and we will send them to Dave, and so he can review them later. And thank you, David Laney, for joining us today for this great and timely conversation. The actual events are starting like as we speak, right? Today.
That's right. That's
correct. And the ceremony is on Friday here.
Friday night, Japan. Friday morning, the US. But yeah, I think softball starts today.
That's right. So everybody, there you go. The Olympics are on. The games are on. We're off. We're going to go on our summer break. We'll see you back on September 7th or 8th, depending on where you are, with Mr. Masaaki Shirakawa. And in the meantime, have a nice summer. Stay healthy, stay well, and take good care. And thank you again, Professor David Laney from Waseda. It was great to have had you here today.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.